This is our video lecture for the very last part of Chapter 14. The final part of the chapter is about debates in macroeconomics. Your book talks about a debate between classical and Keynesian economists. That is way, way out of date. Don't listen to what the book is saying. That's just not what the current debates are. Now, the SAD model you learned about in this course is based on some of Keynes' ideas. We saw during the Great Depression, those predictions fared reasonably well. So we saw GDP rising and falling when predicted. We saw prices rising and falling mostly as predicted. And we also saw unemployment rising and falling at the predicted times in response to different events in the economy and to the government's different responses to those events. We also talked about the Phillips curve earlier in the previous chapters, where the short-run Phillips curve was a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Now, when they were first looking at this back in around 1960 or so, they found that the old Keynesian model actually predicted a Phillips curve relationship. That was pretty exciting. So if we found that data was actually a result of our model, that seems to indicate that our model is on the right track. So we know that Phillips curve is about a trade between inflation and unemployment. Therefore, Phillips curve should be saying that when inflation is high, we're going to have low unemployment. When unemployment is high, we're going to have low inflation. So what they started to do was they try to target low unemployment at the cost of high inflation. However, as we saw back in homework 2, that didn't work very well. What they got was high inflation and high unemployment. That was contrary to the predictions of the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is implied by the old Keynesian model. That meant that it was not very good news for our old Keynesian model. So what came after that, there are some economists that are called new classical economists. They added a different approach looking at the macroeconomy. They had a lot more mathematical rigor than the old Keynesian model. And a key tenet of their models is that prices and wages were flexible. By that I mean that they adjust rapidly, even instantaneously, to events in the rest of the economy. That was not necessarily true. That's not true in the old Keynesian model. We saw back in Chapter 13 that one key factor was the inflexibility of input prices. That was one reason why he got incomplete adjustment in the short run, but he got complete adjustment in the long run. So that was a big area where the new Keynesian economists and the old Keynesian economists and new classical economists differed. The new classical economists also were emphasizing any microeconomic foundations. In our ASAD model, we largely skipped over individual firms, individual households. We just focused on aggregates. In new classical models, they start from individual firms and households, and they build their way up from there to look at the economy as a whole. So that became the orthodoxy for a while. Probably the model is probably closest to that tradition is the real business cycle model. So I just call it the RBC model for short. So the RBC model has the SOMA model, which is a growth model, nested in its foundations. But it also has short fluctuations arising from fluctuations in productivity. Now, the more recent models have gotten on a lot more attention, and is the more popular model, I would say, for sure, is the new Keynesian model. They did borrow some ideas from the new classical economists. They kept the mathematical rigor and even extended that further. And they added some microeconomic foundations. There's been some dispute of whether they've done enough in the microeconomic foundations, but they do have some of those in there. The main area where they're differing is the flexibility of prices and wages. So in a new Keynesian model, if something happens in the economy, prices and wages might not react immediately or might have a less than full response. That's one key feature of those models that differs from the real business cycle model. So that's what the modern debates in macro models are really about. It's not this Keynesian versus classical stuff your book talks about, which was outdated and oversimplified. It's mostly about modeling the flexibility of wages and prices in a market economy.